I told you in a tweet that I had a couple of gifts to help you guys think about accessibility in the work that you do. So that's one of the little tools that we'll go through in a bit. So on the screen, I have a set of escalators. And it's pretty common to see them all kind of stacked together like this. And right now, it's a still picture. So if you think about kind of the path that you take to use escalators, you might start with this one going down, right? So then it's pretty logical to think that the next one that you would go on would be this one going down, this one going up, because you need both directions, right? Seems pretty straightforward. That's kind of what we would expect to see. However, I hope that this makes you feel kind of like friction, and there's a little bit of discord there. What's really going on here? Stupidity. I don't think that it's a requirement that something is an up escalator when it's installed, right? I'm pretty sure you can flip a switch and make it go whichever way. So when somebody's coming down, let's do this again. When somebody is coming down on this escalator, they come over here. The first inclination is to come down this way. They bump into someone, so then they have to move and go this way. And that's a principle that we talk about a lot within usability and accessibility. And it's basically the principle of proximity. That you want to group related things together because it's intuitive that you're going to be conducting the same kinds of actions next to one another in proximity.
Also,
mm-hmm.
just a comment on that. With localization, when people drive on the left-hand side, they would more expect to go down.
Sure, absolutely. And it's the same concept that even if these were the other direction, you would expect that your path is to go down the same way, go up the same way. But you're right, it's a good point too. So we're going to do a little experiment. If you guys all have your straws, go ahead and hold them up. And what I want you to do is to close one eye, and you can pick whichever one you want, and put the straw up to the other eye. And what we're going to do is kind of simulate what it's like to fill out a web form if you can only see through a very narrow kind of viewport. Okay, so everybody ready? No cheating. Don't look with both eyes. So go ahead and fill out that web form. And normally I take a photo, but I'm not going to do that to you guys. And you can go ahead and put it down when you're done. Yeah. So besides this being a pretty ugly form, which we know, this is actually a form we encountered when working with a client team. It's been anonymized to protect the guilty. What are some things that you found yourself doing when you were trying to fill out that form? Yeah. Did you see you were kind of moving back and forth and back and forth and back and forth? And so when you're someone who has low vision and you might have a very, very small viewport that you're looking at, maybe you've zoomed the screen in very, very, very closely in order to be able to see things. The problem that you came across was if you're looking at it here, right, you see these questions, are you a US citizen? Then you have to go all the way over here. By the time you get to this point, you see the button, the radio buttons, and you're supposed to make a selection, and it's not in any way next to the question. Then you go back to question 2, and you go back to the answers for question 2. Then you go back to question 3. You go back to the answers, back to question 4, back to the text input field. So the other thing that's happening is you're establishing a pattern of use. So you get accustomed to this back and forth motion. So the very next thing you're going to do is to go back to that area where you've gotten accustomed to going. And what's the first thing you see? Quit. So then you think, OK, well, before I knew about how far away the answers were, so I'll go that far and look for the button that's maybe not quit. And so I go to the next one, previous. And you kind of give up at that point. The problem with this form, which can be coded perfectly for people who are blind who use screen readers, absolutely perfectly. They have no problems. They can get through that, fly through it, they complete the task, move on. The problem with this form is that it's grouping the wrong elements together visually. And so when you see this, you've got the questions grouped together and the answers grouped together. And so you have to consider the proximity of things when you're looking at how to create a delightful experience for mobile users. You also want to think about that for low vision users as well. Additionally, we talk about this in a lot of UX conversations as well. These 3 buttons have something that we call the same visual weight. So there's no real distinguishing characteristics between what the primary call to action is, except for having to read the text, which increases the cognitive load for anyone because you have to basically decode that at that point. So here's this magic of CSS that we're able to do. So pretty. So this is not a recommendation that every form needs to be visually designed this way, but it's an example of showing how if you're going to be looking at how you group the items together, this makes it something a lot easier for someone to be able to use. It's great for people with low vision. It's great from a mobile user perspective as well. And then if you look as well, we've changed the visual weight for the buttons. So next is very clearly the call to action that you want people to take. And they can also still access those other ones. So if you want to, go ahead and pick up the straw and look through it again and then see how much different it might feel to be able to fill out that form. And there's still going to be some left-right movement back and forth. That's not something that you're looking to completely eliminate, but you want that ease of use to be something much more significant and useful for people. So if you're going here, it's more like this kind of experience, right? So that's something we like to call the straw test. We have some UX cards that we give to people as they're creating user experiences and interactions for people. And it's kind of like if you've ever seen those constraint cards, it gives you a challenge to consider something differently as you're designing and starting to think more inclusively. So we have those in beta, lots of fun. And we use them in a lot of design critiques with teams as well. So accessibility for UX, don't worry, it's much worse than you think. And my name is Elle Waters. You can find me haunting Twitter at Nethermind, and you can email me, elle@simplyaccessible.com. I really answer emails. One of the things that I'll talk about a little bit if we have some time, it's a new guide that we put together, and if you email me, it's yours. And I'll be excited to share it with you, hot off the presses. So this was a question that comes up a lot in my line of work. I work at a company called Simply Accessible. So we provide consulting, design, development, testing, teaching, and partnering to coach teams on how to be able to build more inclusive experiences. So this question really comes up quite often in the work that we do. So why don't people make stuff accessible? And especially people who work in a UX capacity, whether you're a front-end engineer and you work a lot with CSS and you work a lot with creating layouts, pattern libraries, and systems that have a very front UI layer to them, or if you're more of a classic UX professional and you're an information architect or a visual designer, it seems like those individuals with sort of U in the title of what they do should incorporate more accessibility into what they do. So we did a survey a couple of years ago and asked them, why don't you incorporate accessibility into more of what you do? So much like Family Feud, we had the top 3 answers here today. The #1 answer, accessibility is intimidating. Yes. This is no good news, right? When I first started in accessibility, this is a little bit like what my personal library looked like, because I thought, okay, I'm really going to get into this. I'm going to get every book that I know about it, and I'm going to read, and I'd fall asleep reading these boring, obtuse, difficult tomes of information, hoping that they were current, not sure if they were current. And then I went online, because that's what we do as web professionals, and I found there's 203 general techniques for testing web content accessibility guidelines. And then, there's client-side scripting techniques and plain text, ARIA, Flash, if anybody's still using that, Silverlight, if anyone's still using that, PDF, why do we want to use PDFs? But you know what? What we call this in the accessibility industry? A good start. Everybody you talk to, it feels so intimidating, it's overwhelming, it's like climbing a mountain. And then there's all those devices, all those mysterious things, and the plethora of things that people use as personal accommodation and assistive technology in order to be able to use digital, to access digital content. And so you'll have switch devices, and you'll have things that speak to you, and things that you're able to simulate keyboards, and you might have a stylus. You might have something that I thought was a Casio keyboard when I first saw it, a refreshable Braille device, which is really super cool, but it's very unusual to those of us who don't use these every day. And then to top it all off, the most popular screen reader has the scariest name ever, JAWS. So at some point, you can feel completely overwhelmed and say, I'm out. There's no way that I know how to be able to tackle this, so why should I start? Number 2 answer, accessibility is hard. Even if you know what you're supposed to do, there's real work involved in doing that. Yes, accessibility is hard. Everybody has tough days, because accessibility is measured in this binary way. You're either compliant or you're not. So one mistake and you fail, right? And that's the impression that people get. Sometimes you release new features and you don't do end user testing. So do you want a receipt? Yes, next to the red button. No, next to the green button. A little bit confusing, a little off-putting to people. And sometimes we secretly hope that good enough is really just good enough, because we're exhausted, we're doing all these other things. This was at the top of a wheelchair ramp that apparently didn't meet code, but was already built. And so you'll see the push button to be able to open the door electronically. And so, instead of rebuilding the ramp, let's just put a sign that says no wheelchairs permitted on ramp, even though it's at the top of the ramp. So somebody would have to get to the top of the ramp to see it. For wheelchair access, please use west entrance. Sometimes you just want to say, can't you just give me a pass on this? So the ECLIPSE is happening in the United States next week on Monday, and super excited about this. We don't get a lot of good things and a lot of good news these days in America, so this is something we're all kind of hoping for. I'm a little bit concerned. I live in Louisville, Kentucky right now, and it's in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, that has been renamed ECLIPSEville, the point of greatest totality. And thousands of people are coming to Hopkinsville, Kentucky. So I don't know how much people know about the state of Kentucky, but it's a little bit like the show The Leftovers. If you think of Jordan, Texas, and the masses of crowds that are hanging out, and the screaming, angry people who are maybe a little overzealous about their particular ideologies, or the set of Deliverance sometimes. This is what I fully expect. There are no hotels within about 300 miles, and almost all of the campgrounds are rented. And so I live about 2.5 hours away, but to be able to get there with any semblance of sanity, the idea would be that we would be able to probably come a little closer, maybe stay the night somewhere. I'm a little afraid of that. I'm fully expecting the end is near to be like on top of like sky written. It's very possible. So if you don't hear from me again, you'll know at least it was. With that said, I decided, okay, we're going to make this a family trip. I'm going to find a campsite for us to be able to do some camping the night before. And we're just going to go native and get into this, and it'll be awesome and memorable. So I go to recreation.gov. I find this place, Bumpus Mills, Tennessee, which is actually not very far. It's part of Barkley Lakes, not very far from Hopkinsville, Kentucky. And it's a little bit of an old-fashioned site. You can tell it was like a government site just by looking at it, but that's okay. So I decide I'm going to type in, I want to find something from the 20th to the 21st, right? I just want to spend the night before. This is the error message I got. Minimum night stay required for the arrival date selected. Please increase the number of nights selected. So it's like a mystery, because I don't know how many number of nights. So then I change it Sunday to Tuesday. How about that? Put an extra one in there. Minimum night stay required for the arrival date selected. And I thought, okay, I'll just keep trying at this, I guess, until I get something. Because then it becomes like a contest, right? You want to win. And you're like, I don't even expect to stay that long, but I just have to see so that the error message goes away. So Saturday to Wednesday, my family's never going to allow us to do this in Hopkinsville, Kentucky area and that. But hey, that's sure. I'll do that. Nope. Minimum night stay required. Until finally, I put an absurd amount of time. I was like, we're going to be there a week. I want that error message to go away. So I did Friday to Friday. Friday's not reasonable because I'm here on Friday, right? But whatever. Then I got this error message. Those dates are not available. Please adjust your search. So what took me probably 5 minutes of frustration as a web professional who knows a lot about the web and error messaging and validation could have taken somebody with a disability 10 times as much. So on the flip side of this, Clarksville RV Park and Campground has on their homepage, we are fully booked for the solar eclipse. Right there for everyone to see. It's a simple thing. And it's not exceptionally difficult to code this, right? It's a heading. It's just a way of being able to provide that experience for people, and they don't have to have that extreme scenario. So we often like to say that disability is a usability amplifier. If something is 5 minutes of heartache and frustration for someone without a disability, you can assume that it's 10 times as frustrating and difficult and takes them that much longer in order to be able to complete a task. On the flip side, when something is a pleasant user experience and it's easy for you to use, it is 10 times more pleasant for someone who's accustomed to having to struggle through experiences, and to find that makes them incredibly loyal to your brand. So I wanted to share this with you, and we were trying all these cool shenanigans that weren't going to work, and I'm sure it's Apple's fault. I'm fine with that. And is this on? Okay, so there is a mobile app put out by MIT, and it's called ECLIPSE SOUNDSCAPES. And the coolest thing about this is they've created this for people who are not able to see the eclipse because they might have a vision impairment, or they might be blind, or they might be blind and deaf, and it gives them an audio and haptic user experience on the mobile app of the eclipse. And so it has all these different kinds of things that you can look at, of these names of things like corona, helmet streamers, the different kinds of points and the ways that that experience may look to someone with sight, they've recreated. So they say, they call it a rumble map, press to interact with rumble map. So I don't know how much this will go through. What I'm basically doing is, this is the map, and I'm putting my thumb around the corona and then into the area of the greatest totality. And then it's completely silent until I'm on the other side. And it has a haptic sort of vibration experience that gets more significant the brighter the light. They're going to do this live during the eclipse as well, which is a pretty phenomenal experience. When you think about disability being a usability amplifier, it's that kind of stuff that comes to my mind, that you can go so much further with creating an incredibly inclusive environment. The minimum level is to just make it equally easy for everyone. But if you want to take it up a notch, consider different ways that people might be able to experience something. So I highly recommend you guys check this out. It's a great mobile app. It's iOS and Android both. I don't think there's a Windows app for that. So accessibility is hard because good design is hard. And we often tell people that accessibility makes good designers and good developers great designers and great developers. It makes bad designers and bad developers obvious. And so people who want to improve their craft should really look to this, because this is a way to make you incredibly skilled. Third answer, accessibility is not my job. Or really. We get this quote, my work does not involve persons with disabilities. So that would be a pretty spectacularly exclusive kind of work that you do, because 1 in 7 people in the world have a disability. Or if you want to look at it from, say, a developer mindset, that's 15% of the world's population versus 4.2 of internet browser users that use IE or Edge. So when you're thinking about the statistics that you're building towards, it's worth considering. If you need to talk to a marketer, it's $8 trillion of annual global disposable income. It's pretty significant. So 15% of your population, whatever country that you live in, has some kind of disability, and they have money to spend. If you want to talk about what are the extensible benefits of accessibility, everything you do to make something work for someone who's blind or deaf actually helps with findability and search engine optimization. Everything you do to make it something with more accessible to someone with low vision or mobility challenges actually works towards helping your mobile users as well. Those two personas actually map very closely to each other. And everything you do to make things better for someone who has cognitive difficulties makes it more usable and easier for everyone. Braintree recently put this out. Mobile transactions are expected to increase by 74% over the next 3 years, because apparently we weren't going like fast enough on that trajectory. And so now I don't even know it's 74% more than what we're already experiencing would be. That's kind of mind-boggling. But if you're thinking about building for mobile users, this is exactly in the same wheelhouse. If you're thinking about building something with progressive enhancement as a responsive site, this is the same kind of approach. It all works very well together. So if it's not your job, whose job really is it? So I'm going to go through 7 tips for building more inclusive designs. This is from a user experience point of view. I know that I'm at a developer conference, but you guys often get sort of shortchanged. It's not like you don't ever think about the user experience, and it's not just like you're throwing forms up there and that you're a code monkey and this kind of stuff. So out of respect for you guys, I think this is an important piece to be able to put into sort of your toolbox. If you do want to go deep, deep, deep on accessibility from a developer perspective, would love to have those conversations with you. We can talk about SVGs, and we can talk about Angular, all things Angular. We can talk about React. We can talk about all those things and discuss that kind of stuff, and I would love to be able to do that. But really, this is the kind of stuff that sets the foundation. So tip number 1, we recommend creating what we call inclusive personas. And I'm going to send you guys this deck so we don't have to go too deeply. We usually go through this exercise with client teams. The idea is that you don't need to create personas that are your disability personas. You create the personas that you normally would for your product, and you just think about them in a more inclusive way. So an example, this is John, and he's 27 years old. He's a gallery artist. He's a human rights activist. He makes tons of to-do lists. He feels overwhelmed pretty often, and he has autism spectrum disorder. So we made these for different clients, and this is Rose. She's a journalist. She's a graduate student. She doesn't have a whole lot of patience for time wasters. She uses a lot of stuff on her mobile phone. She's been almost completely deaf since birth. And this is Mary. She's 35. She's an exceptional musician. She plays over 11 instruments. She's a professor of ethnomusicology. And she just got this grant for teaching music as an advocacy tool. And she's developing this student performance fundraiser for World Vision for charity. And she's been blind since the age of 13. And she also has parent fatigue, which is kind of a situational disability. Long-lasting. Just as an example, this is from we do a lot of usability testing with people with disabilities. We do almost exclusively remote moderated testing, because unmoderated gives you feedback that you can't follow up on and you don't really understand the why of why something failed. And trying to do something in person and trying to do something either in a lab has a lot of disadvantages between not being able to simulate someone's actual scenario and environment and accommodation, as well as being slow, slow, slow. This allows us to be able to keep pace with agile teams and be able to do these kinds of really quick usability studies. So just to give you, if you have never heard a person who uses a screen reader, it's a radically different experience than people who don't use them daily for their work and their play. So this is an example of one of our usability testing participants setting up TeamViewer, which is one of the applications we use. Yeah, so it's different for people who use a screen reader every day. They use screen readers differently for different kinds of things, but oftentimes it's very transactional. And so what they're doing is they've adjusted so much to the sound of their own screen reader and the commands that are specific to their screen reader that they get through that so much faster. And it doesn't make any sense to someone who may be a sighted user. Even if you use it for testing, which is not usually what we recommend, it's difficult to be able to have a real experience like someone who uses a screen reader. This is Sean. He's 31 years old. He's creating a micro-donation disaster relief mobile app. And he gets bored with technology very quickly. He happens to have low vision, and he requires the screen to have 400% magnification. So if he's a UI engineer in Palo Alto, and you can imagine he's looking at the screen all the time, he gets eye fatigue pretty easily. This is Maxine. She's 61, widowed. She's got 2 children, 5 grandchildren. She owns her own bakery. She wants to use a gift catalog for birthday and holiday gifts for family. She's an extrovert. She has severe arthritis from years of computer work, from managing her own business. So this is an exercise. Like I said, we don't need to go too deeply into that, but we like to go through this because this allows people to start thinking about, these are individuals, these are human beings. These are not just users with disabilities. And so these are all the quotes that we've taken after years of doing usability testing. Buttons can sometimes be too close together for me, and I can't click on small targets. So who might that be? It's a pop quiz. Maxine. Yes, Maxine. Next one. I bump up the font size in my browser to make text easier to read. Sean, you guys are very smart. So, yes, Sean. And something to keep in mind, too, it's not the same thing as bumping up your browser size, right? That text size is different than browser size. And the reason why people like to increase their font size is because not everybody is born with the exact kind of disability they're going to have for their entire lives. And some of these things are progressive, and it can get worse and worse. And so when people are getting used to accommodating what their needs are, they're going to use the least amount of change possible in order to be able to meet their needs. So usually, if they bump up the font size, that's all they may need. And then if they continue to bump up the font size, they don't want to have the idea if you bump up the browser size, all this horizontal scrolling, because they're already doing this action, maybe with the magnified, kind of glass on top. So you see captions as an alternative, but for me, they're my primary format. So some say Mary. How many say Mary? Some say Rose. How many say Rose? Survey says Rose. Captions are actually not usually readable for people who are blind using a screen reader. They would use, and captions are the subtitles, right, that you see on a video. They would use a text transcript if they wanted to go through it very quickly in a text format, or they would just listen to the audio of a video. They also have something that would be called an audio described file that sometimes is an add-on. You'll see that in Netflix and other things, and it's this incredibly masterful art of people being able to slide in an audio description of what's happening on the screen that isn't necessarily available to someone who can't see it. So Rose, on the other hand, reads captions for any of the multimedia content that she would experience. I need to use the keyboard, but on certain web pages, I just can't. So which one of these people needs to use a keyboard? Yeah, Mary. And some people will be a low vision user that will combine things like a screen magnification software along with the keyboard, and they'll go back and forth. And they'll kind of combine all these different kinds of experiences. But Mary, as a screen reader user, has no choice. This is the way that she consumes the web. This is the way that she gets information. And because her screen reader reads from the DOM, it's all very linear, the content. If she's going to go through something, she's thinking about it in that source order. And so how something is displayed visually really needs to match how something is handled under the hood as well, because that's what matters for Mary. I'm worried I won't be able to use the internet to do my job. Truth is, everybody, right? This is a very significant and real concern for people with disabilities because it's a matter of livelihood for them. It's not, can I just shop online because I want to? Even though, yes, that's actually a huge significant benefit because there's no need to then go into a brick and mortar store. But it's, can I actually pay my bills online? Can I pay my rent online? There's some really basic life things that we do and we start to take for granted to realize that everyone needs to have that access. So here's some other things that you can read through later if you guys want to. You can download the deck. And just different examples of what people have told us during usability testing, and it's worth considering. Tip 2, incorporate people with disabilities into your design process. So if you're looking at it from a UX perspective, oftentimes people ask the question after they've created a combination, a group of personas, and they'll ask, who's my primary user and who's my secondary user? And they'll focus a lot of their designs on these personas building it against the primary and secondary user. So within UX, there's different kinds of practices, and there's different kinds of disabilities that can be really well represented in the design process. For one, to start with, information architects and content strategists. We would recommend their primary user be anyone who's neurally diverse, somebody who might have cognitive challenges, who might be aging into dementia, or even someone who's a non-native language user also counts for that. Or they might have a low literacy. They might have a learning disability. This is really useful when you're designing for, you're figuring out what the content strategy is going to be, what the sitemap and architecture of the site is going to be. And you can conduct usability testing with paper prototypes. Because these people have great vision, they don't necessarily have any visual problems, so why not bring them into that process when you're developing that? For the visual designer, we recommend that the primary user is a low vision user and the secondary user would be a colorblind user. Those two things really help them understand things like layout, color, not trying to use color to convey meaning. If something is a hover, like it's a focus state, you need to make sure that that thing is understandable without the need to be able to distinguish between colors. It allows you to think in terms of contrast. So oftentimes people who have really limited vision have difficulty when you say have a modal dialogue and it doesn't really have any kind of boundaries. And so it's difficult for them to see. You can conduct usability testing with high fidelity mockups. With these individuals, you could have a clickable prototype and be able to do, get great findings from that. Persona mapping for the interaction designer. And so if you're doing interaction design, you're really thinking about user behavior and you're thinking about task flows. So mobility challenged users, anybody who might use a keyboard or people who have limited mobility, there are some people where it's physically painful for them to do 40 tab stops in order to complete a task. So it's great to use these people as your primary user that you're designing for. And then of course blind users, because the way that they perceive and interact with things is a very different mental model. So you can have these people participate in usability studies with HTML prototypes, but you really have to ensure that the keyboard accessibility is spectacular. Otherwise, you're kind of wasting both of your time, right? Tip number 3, obvious wins. Call it what it is. How many of you guys are familiar with the hamburger menu? This is like a moment in time. Facebook decided this was an awesome design idea and a pattern they would put out there, and it caught on and it grew and everybody thought it was fantastic. And then at some point, people decided to put it through usability testing. And they found that lots of people didn't understand what are these pancakes? What are these lines? I don't understand. And they didn't know what the purpose of that icon was for. And it wasn't really intuitively understandable. So they found through usability testing that the icon itself tested poorly. Using the word menu tested better. But what tested best was using the menu icon and the word menu together. So call it what it is. Make it really obvious so that no one's confused and having to hunt through what interactions that you want them to do on your app or your site. Tip 4, make it simple and make it easy. If you guys were in the previous talk, they had a great amount of recommendations for UI patterns, and a lot of those go back to make it a simple, consistent user experience. One of the worst experiences on the web, which is also one of the most fundamentally necessary experiences on the web, is completing a form. And how you recover from error messaging is really a huge point, especially if you're doing it for something that you want someone to purchase. How they recover from error messaging is a really critical moment in that user interaction. So we have an example here, and you can find it at sateach.es, errors with skip links. And we've run this through years of usability testing. And there are certain features about this error handling that really test well. The first one is if you have multiple errors, you put them in a summary bucket at the top. You start it with a heading. You give not only color to convey that there's an error, but you also use an icon that people can recognize. A small thing that means so much to people is actually putting the number of errors so people know, is it worth their time to get in there and fix all those things? Having clickable links within the summary bucket tested really, really well because people can then jump directly to the error field and they're able to correct it. This is a little bit of a beta thing. Sometimes this does really, really well, but it's not necessarily like as tried and true recommendation as the other things. But we have this as well, where somebody who has limited mobility, it might be really painful for them to tab through all the way down through a really long, complex form. And so instead, they can select this, and it jumps right to the next field that's in error. At field level and at page level, we recommend, especially for multiple errors on a page, you should have error messaging for both. It should be explicit. It should be very straightforward as to what needs to be fixed about it. So as complex as form error messaging is, the simpler and easier to understand, the better. Tip 5, make it predictable and make it consistent. A really good friend of mine said, it's better if you have a shitty pattern library than no pattern library at all. And I tend to agree. It doesn't matter where you're at in that journey and process. Every time I ask people, so do you have a pattern library, like a component library or a design system? There's this look of shame because they're not working with a PDF style guide anymore, but everything they're doing is usually a work in progress. And so we recommend just get started. It's meant to be a living thing. It's meant to act almost like a product and start working off of that. And again, they talked about last session, about the benefits of this. You're all speaking the same common language, and it's easier for people who are using your systems to know what to expect. Tip 6, design and build with progressive enhancement. It's not an out-of-date thing. It's really, honestly, the best way. If you're going to build a progressive web app, if you're going to be thinking in responsive web, if you're going to be building stuff for the majority of people, you need to be thinking about it from a progressive enhancement perspective. This is an autocomplete feature. Those are typically pretty difficult to make fully accessible. And we just created the UI pieces to it for very explicit recommendations, as well as challenges that people experience and how to actually code it. And we have a working example on our site. So excited to share this with you guys. We have a lot of other examples on our site as well, but this one in particular is something that we've been working really hard on just because it sounds like, what, it's just this one widget. And yet, it's difficult to be able to make these things fully accessible. So if you guys want to send me an email, I'll be happy to share this guide with you. Last tip, assume nothing, go see, or in Agile terms, Gemba. When we did usability testing almost 3 years ago, it was when responsive web was really becoming a thing with some of these bigger, older organizations. And so we were excited that they were actually building things in a responsive way. What we didn't realize, and we do this for a living, but it was a new discovery for us, we didn't realize until we did usability testing, we found that there are, say, 3 out of 5 screen reader users who may live at home and don't have any sighted partners, and they live at home alone. And they had no need for a monitor, so they didn't buy a monitor. And so there was no monitor hooked up to their computer. So if you've ever thought about how that works, Windows will have a monitor, right? It's still, there's some, I mean, they'll have a browser if you open a browser, but there's no monitor to display it. And what it does is it puts it in like a 150 by 150 pixel kind of layout. If you have a breakpoint that renders a mobile view because of the size, right? That means someone is using a desktop with a desktop screen reader and a full keyboard with your mobile site. And that changes things, right? Because there's no swipes, there's no gestures that they're doing. They're using it all fully with a keyboard. This was pretty groundbreaking for us to realize. And it's a reminder that you can never really fully anticipate what everyone is going to be doing with your content. And so it's really useful to go and see and to do usability testing so that you can really get that feedback and understand how your users are using your product. Final note to my developer friends, like science, web standards exist, whether you believe in them or not. Yeah, and I'm an American, and I know that we say there's such things as alternative facts and fake news, but this is the truth. This is reality. And so we've done research on the testing that we've done for several years, and we found that 60 to 70% of the accessibility issues that we find during tests and audits are actually attributable back to just best practices. So you already have the power to do good and to do things well. You already know if you're the best developer or the best designer that you can be, that you're going to win on some accessibility best practices because they're built in. The web was made to be accessible. Finally, my favorite quote of the month, I guess, is August de la Reyes. He's the head of design at Pinterest. And he said, disability is actually an outcome of design. So it's not the person that's disabled, it's the design patterns that were put into place that didn't consider that person. And it's worth thinking about when you look at the things that you're building, that you're either designing to include or you're designing to exclude. So I leave you with this. It can be tough, but you guys can go with some tried and true, just best practices and these tips, and you will succeed. You really will. And don't think in terms of a binary accessible, not accessible, but more inclusive or less inclusive. And hopefully you'll choose more. So that's my talk, and I think we have a couple minutes left for some discussion if you guys have any questions or comments. Yes? Yeah.
When people think about accessibility and disabilities, it's very easy to think the big things. Here's a person who's blind.
Right.
Who's deaf. Here's a person who doesn't have any arms. But one thing people don't do is consider the smaller problems that a lot of people have. So the company I work for, we build hardware and software solutions for truck drivers.
Mm-hmm.
And you think a truck driver probably isn't going to have any form of disability because they need to have good eyesight to drive on the roads, need to have working limbs to control their vehicles. But actually, if you look at especially American truck driver demographic, you're looking at mid-50s,
Yep.
Very poor diets and very likely to be overweight.
Yeah.
are not the smartest people on the planet. So although they're not disabled the way that people think, that there is actual problems. So they can see the road, they may struggle with the mobile app. So you need big tech.
Yep.
Big
That's
iPhones.
great.
They've got fat fingers because they have a very unhealthy diet. So again, you need big buttons so they don't press too many.
That's fantastic insight.
Simple because they're not particularly smart people. So yeah, they're not the classic disabled, but you always have to think about accessibility in terms of what are the small things we can do.
Absolutely. I think that's great insight. So we often do think about severe disabilities or very plainly obvious disabilities. But not only, I thought it was really interesting, you're pointing out the things that change as far as with age. People who are aging into disabilities are in this room, every single one of us. Because it comes to a point where when you hit about 70, it's about a 50% coin flip as to whether or not you're going to have a severe disability or not. And that's straight out of World Health Organization. And I think the other great point that you mentioned too is that people will have a combination of things happening. So I have rheumatoid arthritis in my back, but you guys don't know that, right? Because I'm medicated and because we don't go hang out skiing and you see that I'm just a total wuss, right? But there's lots of different things that may be going on with somebody at any given time. And so considering all of this and using these best practices just creates a more inclusive experience. And I think it's fantastic because you know your users really well. And so you're thinking about how big their fingers are. And maybe there's a lot of mental fatigue because it's, you know, draining for them to have this kind of career. And to your point, there's some literacy issues and maybe even cognitive difficulties that are not classic things like Alzheimer's or even autism, or they're not even necessarily considered in the spectrum, so to speak, but they just may have some, you know, lower, more intellectually challenging kind of experiences. So I think that's great. Yeah.
You mentioned that when you've got that 150 pixel sort of window in
Yeah.
someone's, would you expect that people who don't have a screen are using the default browser on the computer, or do they go out of their way to use a particular browser?
It depends. Yeah, so with screen reader users, there's 3 popular screen readers that are the most common, and it's typically what we test with as well. So you'll have JAWS, and you'll have something called Non-Visual Desktop Access, NVDA, which is free. JAWS is very expensive, and it has an update every single year, making you buy it pretty much in full every year. And then there's another one, VoiceOver, which comes natively with any kind of Mac or iOS operating system. The browsers and the assistive technology creators tend to partner up. So if you use JAWS, you are most likely to use Internet Explorer. And so they tend to be aware of each other's updates, and assistive technology vendors will think about like what differences there are in Edge. And JAWS, the Freedom Scientific, the creators of JAWS, will think about that when they're rolling out updates. NVDA, which is free and heavily, heavily driven by research and development, also tends to be more standards compliant. Not surprisingly, works best with Firefox because it too kind of has that, you know, personality. And then VoiceOver users usually will be using Safari. And so if you have a Windows system, Internet Explorer will come, you know, free with that. And so it's typical that somebody might, if they install JAWS, they'll be using that Internet Explorer browser. If somebody needs to install Firefox because they understand they're using NVDA, then they'll download that and use that. Hi, yes.
How do you find users for your user research?
That's a great question. How do we find users for our user research? A combination of ways. So we have a usability panel of about, I don't know, it's over 500 people now at this point, because it is, again, it is our practice, and so it's what we do very often. So we have been sort of cultivating these participants for a while, but we always have to continually grow that user base. So what we do is we'll have surveys that we send out on Twitter. And if you have ever wanted to know more than you ever thought you needed to know about accessibility, you can go onto Twitter and use a hashtag A11Y. And you'll see the whole community, and it'll be people who are advocates, people who are end users, people who work in the industry in accessibility, people who are curious about specific things. And so we reach out to disability advocacy groups, just personally, because we have good relationships with different groups. The National Federation for the Blind, that's usually going to be people that are blind, but they do have users who are low vision, but not many. We usually go to groups like Lighthouse for people who are low vision users, the United Cerebral Palsy Foundation for people who have mobility impairments, and we ask them to work with us. And so if you're new to usability studies, it's imperative that I impart this one thing: pay your participants. It's insulting to ask them to do this for you for free when it's really something that you're gaining from a professional context. So if you're offering $100, $75, and I'm speaking in US dollar terms, gift certificate or Visa or Amazon gift card, you will get participants. And we do all of the classical things like creating screeners to make sure that we're recruiting the right individuals, the right combination of individuals. So mostly it's Twitter. We work a lot with our own clients, customers, and our own usability panel and advocacy groups as well. Yes?
Do you work together with universities?
We do. We work with universities. It's a different scenario as far as universities because they have a commitment to provide individual accommodation. And so it's a different scenario usually as far as, I mean, it's great as far as if you were looking for usability testing participants, but as far as their needs, it's a different kind of challenge with universities because they have learning plans and things like that for different individuals. And so it's both needs to be high level and broad, but also very specific to specific needs. Any other questions? Yes?
When filling out forms, quite often the error message will pop up next to the field that the input is not right. How accessible or inaccessible is that?
It depends on how it was done, right? So that's like the UX catch-all. It depends. But field level error messaging is a huge benefit to people with disabilities when it's done properly. So there's a lot of considerations. One would be we usually recommend that the error messaging content is actually within the context of the label. Or you can use something that's called Accessible Rich Internet Application, ARIA, and you can basically programmatically associate it with that field. So that tells someone who's using a screen reader, and keep in mind that ARIA is really a great bridge technology for one subset of people with disabilities, people who use screen readers. So it's not I'll go out and put ARIA on all the things, and then suddenly everything's accessible. But it does have some really great benefits in associating things that are sort of inert things and creating those relationships. So that would be one thing. The other is for low vision users, you really want that error messaging to be really close in proximity to where it is. So if you've zoomed in on the screen, it's not far flung on the other side of the page, right? That's two examples. Yes?
I just saw your list of requirements or suggestions.
Yes.
For the autocomplete. What about a calendar date picker?
Yes, another favorite. So there's like things that are like the holy grail, right? And like these things that you love to hate them. Date pickers are challenging because they're not like native elements, right? You're kind of making it up. Anything that's a widget, you want to consider the fact that you're pretty much forcing people to adopt a user interaction pattern that isn't really ubiquitous. So how people code a date picker is not so locked down. Tabs used to be that way, now they're pretty standardized. Sliders used to be that way, and now we've really actually got like range elements and things like that that do it for us. But a date picker, you almost want to think of it as, here's kind of some best practices. You want to be able to use tab at the higher level of whatever the widget is, and then if you need to interact with that thing, you would be using the arrow keys. And then you tab to get out of it or enter to continue on. We do have some on our example site too.
So would you even use that metaphor?
Which metaphor?
Or
Yeah.
that would be easier? You know,
Well, we want to make sure that somebody isn't required to use a date picker. and that there's multiple ways to do the same thing. So having a text input next to the date picker is really the best, the best of both worlds. But date pickers are great. They're fine. They work well. You just have to be conscious of focus management, and you have to think about where you're actually sending a user, and you want to do some testing on it to make sure. And you want to test not just happy path. You want to be able to go backwards as well and shift tab and assume that somebody's going to be using it in a lot of different ways. Yeah, but we have some examples of that as well on our site. We work with a lot of airline clients, so you can imagine date pickers are, we've seen so many, and seat maps, so many. But yeah, I mean, those things are usable. You just have to consider the interaction model of tabbing into the thing that you want them to work with and that workflow, and then once they're done, they tab back out of it. Otherwise, if you're only using tabs, for example, it becomes very complicated. Yes?
How easy is it to detect that an end user is using a screen reader or has their font ramped up or has issues? Because if you're building like a SaaS platform, the management are saying, we don't need to worry about accessibility.
Right.
It's really good to have some stats to beat them with to say, well, actually, you do because we detected this number of users use screen readers.
So the question is basically, is there a way to automatically detect people with disabilities using your app or your site? And you can use that power for good, or you could use that power for evil. And I'll tell you, this is kind of a thing to unpack a little bit. People with disabilities have a really significant concern about that in particular, because the human side of that is, are you delivering a different experience to them because of them having to self-identify without being asked whether or not they have a disability? So there's a big concern around privacy and about sort of a lesser experience and diverting them to something that's usually an impossibility to keep it in sync with the newest and hottest parts of your application. It never works when you have this separate but equal concept. It's never equal. So that's one of the first concerns about it. From a technical perspective, not everyone uses something that's programmatically detectable, because somebody who is using something at the operating system level isn't going to be detected via the browser necessarily. And some people are using something that might be, for example, you could detect if somebody uses only a keyboard on your site. But you may not know. It might be a developer, right? Because you guys do that. And instead, it could just be somebody who's got a modified keyboard and they're using a stylus because they're paralyzed from the neck down. So they have a disability, but all you're able to really detect is keyboard usage. And then finally, even screen readers are kind of variable. On a desktop, Apple is a closed system. You aren't able to get that kind of thing. JAWS has an API that you can ping and be able to detect if somebody's using JAWS. But it only starts getting you these marginal slices of things, and it doesn't really tell you. So if somebody's colorblind, you won't be able to detect that. And that's 1 in 8 men are colorblind, and so that's actually a pretty high statistic, and so you want to think in terms of contrast. And then finally, there's a lot of those cognitive challenges that you'll never be able to get at. So it's really better to think in terms of universal design and then go with the statistics from like World Health Organization and assume that you have some kind of similar representation of users. Unless you have a very specific, you're building a site and it's for a specific type of user group that isn't probably prone to have disabilities, that's possible, or maybe especially skewed towards people with disabilities. Like if you have a site that you build for older people, you already know you're probably gonna have a higher percentage. So I would love to keep in touch with you guys, and please feel free to email me. I have an autocomplete guide. I have a modal dialogue guide, and these are all from a user interaction design, but also front-end development perspective. We're pretty technology agnostic. We love all the technologies, and so if we can be of any help, definitely send me an email. So thanks very much, you guys.